Considered just how amazing your brain is, that something so small can hold so much power and knowledge? Different fields of science, such as neurology and psychology, join forces just to solve the mysteries of the brain. Unless you know someone with a brain related condition, you probably don't often think about your brain potentially getting damaged. It might come as a surprise, but there are lots of special medical cases that all lead back to a brain tumor or head injury. In this book, you will read about the extraordinary patients of Dr. Oliver Sacks, the author of this book and an expert neurologist. These stories are so strange that you will probably scratch your head while reading about the patient's conditions. Continue on and be amazed at how powerful your brain can be by listening to this book summary, right here on Giggle. Great ideas, great life. My name is Mohita and I am a Giggler. And I will be summarizing the book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and Other Clinical Tales by Dr. Oliver Sacks. The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. Imagine for a moment that you cannot remember any faces. You look at a person's face, smile at them, and even talk to them, but the minute you look away, you forget what the person looked like. The person you just spoke to seconds ago becomes a complete stranger in your eyes. Some people live with this kind of condition because their visual processing is flawed. It could be due to a head injury or some trauma that has affected the brain. These patients simply can't process a face, and instead, they rely on distinct features to recognize someone, such as dimples on both cheeks or a mole on the tip of the nose. Mr. P was a well-known musician and teacher. Everyone brushed it off as his weird sense of humor, that he recognized his students not by face but by voice. Mr. P would also treat non-living things, such as fire hydrants and doorknobs, as people, and he would even talk to them. He had diabetes, and he feared that because of his health condition, he would go blind in the future. That was the reason why Mr. P went to an ophthalmologist. However, the eye doctor said that Mr. P had no problems with his vision and suggested he consult a neurologist instead. That is how they first met initially. Dr. Sacks did not see anything strange about Mr. P. However, as they talked more, Dr. Sacks noticed that Mr. P studied every feature of his face. Mr. P looked at his left eye, then right eye, and then his chin. Mr. P could not see Dr. Sacks' face as a whole. Dr. Sacks became unsettled by the way Mr. P studied his features so intently. He conducted the usual examinations on Mr. P concerning muscle strength, coordination, and reflexes. These exams required Mr. P to remove his left shoe. Dr. Sacks asked Mr. P to put his shoe back on, but after a few minutes, Mr. P's left foot was still shoeless. Dr. Sacks offered to help him, but Mr. P replied that his foot was already inside the shoe. Only when Dr. Sacks pointed out that his left foot was still on the floor did Mr. P realize the truth. He said, "Ah, I thought that was my foot," referring to Dr. Sacks' foot. Apart from that strange interaction, Dr. Sacks didn't see anything wrong with Mr. P. Dr. Sacks took out a magazine and asked Mr. P to describe the pictures in it. Mr. P would point out a color, a shape, or any small feature on the page, but he would never describe the picture as a whole. Dr. Sacks asked him to describe the picture of the Sahara Desert. Mr. P replied that there was a river and a little guest house, even though there was no such thing. Dr. Sacks was stunned by his answer, but Mr. P thought that the doctor was impressed with him. When it was time for Mr. P to leave the clinic, he began searching for his hat. Nearby, his wife was seated waiting for him. Suddenly, Mr. P took hold of his wife's head as if to lift it off and put it on his head. Mr. P mistook his wife for a hat. Dr. Sacks visited Mr. P at home to continue his examinations. Although he could recognize shapes and cartoon characters, Mr. P failed to name the people in the pictures and photos that were all over his apartment. These pictures were of him, his co-workers, and his students. If, in the rare instance, a person was familiar to him, Mr. P would be able to identify the individual because of a distinct feature, such as a square jaw. He looked at things through clues and unique features, not for what they were as a whole. The man who fell out of bed. We often forget just how complex our brains are. The small organ inside our skull can hold hundreds of memories, names, and basically anything you can think of. It doesn't look like much, but we usually can rely on our brains. Although it's easier to spot what's wrong in our brain today compared to 100 years ago, there are still many unsolved mysteries when it comes to our minds. If your brain suffers from a blood clot or an air bubble forms inside a blood vessel, this could have disastrous consequences to our minds. Even if the source of injury is a tiny part of your brain, it can affect the rest of your body because your brain is connected to everything. Our brain acts as the central control of our whole body. Once Dr. Sachs was called to a room that held a patient, a young man, who seemed okay before he took a nap. The young man was admitted to the hospital because another doctor claimed he had a lazy left leg. When the young man woke up, he laid down on the floor and refused to go back to the bed. He was staring at his left leg the whole time. Dr. Sachs asked the young man if he could return to his bed. The mere suggestion caused the patient to shake his head furiously, claiming that a severed human leg was on the bed. The young man was upset at what he observed at the horrible sight. Before Dr. Sachs could say anything more, the young man exclaimed about a cold and strange-looking leg on his bed. He said that it must be a joke done by a nurse with a dark sense of humor. Since it was New Year's Eve, the nurse might have drunk too much and decided to make fun of him. The young man concluded that a nurse must have taken out a severed leg and placed it on his bed and appeared proud of himself to have solved the mystery. Suddenly, the young man threw the leg out of the bed. With trembling lips, he declared that the leg was chasing him because now it was attached to his own body. He panicked and he tried to remove his own leg while shouting how disgusting and horrifying it was. The young man continued punching his own leg until Dr. Sachs intervened, saying that it was his own leg and not just a random person's leg. The young man thought that Dr. Sachs was also making fun of him, and it took him a while to realize that it was indeed just his own leg. The young man explained that it didn't feel like it was his own leg because it felt foreign. Dr. Sachs then asked the young man that if it wasn't his leg, then where was his real left leg? The young man looked like he was about to faint, but he still managed to reply that his leg had disappeared and that it was nowhere to be found. On the level. While we recognize the 5 senses, there is an additional unconscious and automatic sense known as the 6th sense. This sense helps you know that your arms are resting at your sides, that your legs are at the lower part of your body, and that your body is properly aligned. This 6th sense is called proprioception. We often take this for granted because it's so obvious and simple that we don't give it a second thought. However, without proprioception, your body won't feel like it's your body. Proprioception is often ignored or undiscussed because we don't have any reason to pay attention to it. Only when it's missing do we notice it. Dr. Sachs met Mr. McGregor in the neurology clinic of a retirement village. Others had noted that Mr. McGregor leaned to the side when he walked, but he insisted that he was walking straight as a stick. To determine who was right, Dr. Sachs asked Mr. McGregor to walk in a straight line and told him that he would record a video of him. Dr. Sachs took note that even though he was 93 years old, Mr. McGregor was still alert and he didn't look his age. Mr. McGregor confidently stood up and did as he was told. Dr. Sachs saw for himself that Mr. McGregor didn't walk straight. He leaned towards the side. What other people observed was true. Mr. McGregor was shocked and surprised when he saw himself in the video. He said that he didn't feel that he was leaning to the side at all. Dr. Sachs explained to the old man about proprioception. Mr. McGregor gave an example to make sure that he understood the concept. The old man replied, to confirm he understood about the sixth sense, that other people have a small voice inside their head that tells them, "Don't lean to the side, walk straight." But he doesn't have that small voice. Mr. McGregor related it to his former job as a carpenter. He had experience using a tool called a spirit level, which tells carpenters if a surface is exactly level or not. It looks like a bar with a water tube in the middle. When the surface is leveled, the water bubble will be steady in the middle. But when the surface is tilted at all, the bubble will slide up or down to one side. Mr. McGregor had Parkinson's disease, and it was due to this health problem that his natural body spirit level was destroyed. Dr. Sachs and Mr. McGregor joined forces to solve the old man's problem of leaning when he walked. They attached an extended horizontal level to each side of Mr. McGregor's glasses so that he would see if he was leaning to one side or not. It was difficult at first because Mr. McGregor had to keep checking the levels every time, but soon he got used to it. The old man finally walked as straight as a stick. Eyes right. It's challenging to treat conditions like the one in the case of Mr. McGregor because the patient is not aware that there is something wrong. The doctor must work together with the patient to discover the issue and the solution, or find techniques that the patient can easily adapt with and turn into a habit. Believe it or not, some people can see through only one eye, but not because they are blind. This particular issue may be because the part of their brain that deals with vision is damaged. If the patient wants to see the other side, he will need to turn 360 degrees so that he can see the whole room. A CCTV camera can also be helpful for people with this condition so that they can see everything around them, even though they only have one functioning eye. Mrs. S suffered from a terrible stroke that affected the right cerebral hemisphere of her brain. Because of this, she couldn't see with her left eye. She often complained that the tray of food the nurses brought her didn't contain the cup of dessert, even though the dessert was sitting right there on the left side of the tray. The nurses had to keep reminding Mrs. S that her dessert was there. They told her to turn her head and use her right eye to look. Then she would see it. Due to the stroke, Mrs. S could not perceive anything on her left side. When she put on makeup, she only did the right side of her face. The other side remained makeup-free. Mrs. S had adapted the turning in circles technique so she could see things on her left. Yet there were still moments when she failed to do so. All of her impulses automatically favored her right side and only her right side. When Dr. Sachs set up a video camera for Mrs. S, she was finally able to see the left side of her face. However, viewing her left side made her upset, and in the end, she refused to look. The President's Speech. Aphasia refers to the inability to understand and comprehend words, including being unable to understand what is being said by others. Diagnosing aphasia is a long and tedious process. The neurologist has to see the patient speak and behave in a strange way. Strange in the sense that the patient doesn't speak with any expression or emotion whatsoever. Some aphasiacs even speak with a robotic voice. Since aphasiacs cannot understand words, they rely on non-verbal cues, such as tone, body language, and facial expression of the person speaking. Because of this, aphasiacs can easily determine if the person is lying or not. They immediately know if the person is genuine or just faking. There is another extraordinary condition called agnosia, which is basically the complete opposite of aphasia. People with agnosia understand the words spoken and only the words. They don't take into account the tone and feeling behind a sentence. Agnosiacs cannot process nonverbal cues and do not understand jokes or sarcasm at all. The hospital ward was filled with laughter as the aphasia patients watched the president's speech on TV. They observed how the president spoke and they thought he was inauthentic. They could understand what he was saying, but it was obvious to the aphasiacs that the president was not being genuine. Aside from the aphasiacs, the agnosia patients were also there watching the president's speech. Emily, a former English teacher, was diagnosed with agnosia. She could not appreciate the president's tone or body language or facial expression, but she said that the president's speech was terrible. She was unimpressed. She said that maybe the president had brain damage or maybe he was hiding something. Yes, father, sister. Unfortunately, there are several ways in which you can damage your brain, such as a major accident or a degenerative disease like Parkinson's. Even though countless research has been done about our brains, there are still so many factors that remain a mystery. The brain is so complex that if any part of it is damaged, there will be a striking consequence in the human body. For instance, if the frontal lobes of a human brain are covered with cancerous tissues, it can result in personality changes in the patient. This condition cannot be treated. Mrs. B was a former research chemist. Her problem started with sudden shifts of mood, from funny to impulsive to superficial. This gave her friends the impression that Mrs. B no longer cared about them. They did not know that a brain tumor caused these sudden shifts in Mrs. B's personality. One day, Dr. Sachs met Mrs. B. She addressed him alternately as father or sister or doctor. When asked to explain why, Mrs. B said that Dr. Sachs' face and beard reminded her of a priest, yet his clothing reminded her of a nun. So she called him father and sister accordingly. She only called him doctor because of the stethoscope that hung around his neck. Mrs. B also explained that she knew the differences between the three terms, but she didn't think it of much importance. Mrs. B's outlook was this: nothing matters because everything was the same in her eyes. This idea did not bother her. Hands. Imagine that there's an upcoming exam and you're nervous because it will make or break your grades for the semester. You try to study, but every time you open a book, you can't absorb what you're reading. All you can think about is that you will fail the exam. You cannot concentrate because of this fear. You overthink and it prevents you from doing anything else. This is an example of how powerful your thoughts are. When you believe that you cannot achieve something, you will never succeed. When your mind says you can't, your body will learn to limit itself. Take the case of Madeline, a 60-year-old woman who was blind and sick with cerebral palsy. Aside from this, both of her hands moved involuntarily, and she could not use them. From the day she was born, her family looked after her because she was disabled. Since she did not have control of her hands, Madeline couldn't learn and also could not read using Braille. She relied on other people to read for her. Dr. Sachs was surprised when he learned this because he thought that Madeline's disability of her hands was not that severe. Madeline could sense a light touch, pain and temperature with her hands, but she couldn't identify objects with them, not even Dr. Sachs' hands. This puzzled Dr. Sachs because he believed that if Madeline could feel some sensations, then she should be able to touch objects and recognize them. Dr. Sachs realized that maybe Madeline did not learn to use her hands because her family did everything from her from the day she was born. All of them believed that Madeline's involuntarily moving hands were useless. Because of this belief, Madeline never explored what she can do with her hands. Going against what you believe in can be difficult. For many years, Madeline believed that her hands had no use. But Dr. Sachs thought of a simple plan to help her. He suggested that the nurse should accidentally leave Madeline's food tray slightly out of reach. When Madeline became impatient and hungry, she could not wait for the nurse anymore. She started to reach out for her food. For the first time in 60 years, Madeline was able to use her hands. She improved significantly after this experiment. Soon, Madeline was able to make clay sculptures of faces, heads, and other figures. Conclusion. There are several things you learned from this book. First, the brain is such a delicate yet powerful part of our body. Second, When the brain gets affected, there is a big chance that other parts of the body will be affected as well. Third, even slight damage to the brain can cause terrible consequences. Learning about rare conditions can help us understand patients who have them. Their lives are difficult, but we can be kind and considerate. We can also try to encourage them. Just because they have this rare condition or disease, it doesn't mean that they should live a miserable life. There is still a way for them to be happy and successful, especially if they are surrounded by people who understand and support them. With help, these patients can do more and live a higher quality of life. This brings us to the end of the summary of the book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and Other Clinical Tales by Dr. Oliver Sacks. How do you feel now that you have finished listening to the whole book summary? Did you have fun? Was it insightful? Let us know in the comments below. Also, leave us a feedback on Play Store because it helps us improve. Make sure to browse through our library of Hindi and English book summaries and pick the next book that interests you. See you around. Jai Hind!